often people ring me or chat with me, and sometimes I'm in tears, because they're struggling so much.
It's such a relief, and just so nice to have, your own home and look out your own window into the garden. And
we didn't know what would happen.
And the reference point being the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. That was a real boom.
The laws changing put it on my radar.
And we just looked at each other and we just said, we're shafted. We've been shafted.
I was saying just a very simple thing, but you could hear the support that was literally at my back, And I thought, well, this has got legs.
This is Candid Tiny House. I'm your host, Shannon Schultz from Fred's Tiny Houses. Usually this is a podcast interviewing people about their tiny house builds. This season 2, we're doing something different. Last June in 2023, the local shire here in central Victoria, Mount Alexander Shire, did something extraordinary. They passed a local law that allowed for living in a tiny house on wheels on private property without a permit or a time limit. They removed the biggest barrier to living in a tiny house on wheels that there is, which is council regulations. It was huge. We got national media attention, a lot of happy community members, and a new option for affordable housing in our region. We also got a lot of people from other councils and in other states and all around Australia calling up and asking us, how did you do this? We want to do the same thing here. So this podcast is in answer to that question. This season we talked to all the key players involved in the change, what they did, what were the factors for their success, and what were the obstacles that they faced and how did they overcome or revert them. And most importantly, what are active things that you can do to replicate the same change in your hometown? So, let's dive in. Our story of success actually begins with a story of relative failure. Back in 2020, Fred Schultz led a campaign for changing the tiny house laws in our area, and it just wasn't the resounding success that we had hoped for. But it paved the way for a second attempt to get its footing and to take hold. So this first episode delves into the first attempt to change the laws, because without it, the second attempt might not have happened, and it certainly might not have been as successful. Let me explain. In between 2009 and 2019, the local law here in Mount Alexander Shire was that you could live in a caravan on private property for 6 weeks cumulatively within a year. This was and remains a very standard policy for many local councils in Victoria, Tasmania and Queensland. It's kind of a cut and paste option for local councils in built up areas. Fred and I lived in our tiny house with our first child here in 2016 under those laws. We were lucky enough to be hosted by Christine Henderson, who happened to be mayor at the time. There's just a little bit of a language warning here in the first few minutes of the show.
We lived in our tiny house under these kind of circumstances, and it is stressful under the old law because we didn't really have permanence. And if somebody says, hey, you can't do that anymore, you're experiencing housing stress, which is one of the key factors for whether you qualify as being homeless if you're experiencing housing stress. So until there was social sanction for living in a tiny house / caravan for an extended period of time, you would be experiencing housing stress. So
indeed, I was experiencing housing stress. When we were living in our tiny house, even though there were no complaints, we were living under the 6-week rule, and we exceeded that to the tune of 6 months. And it was stressful for me. I hated it because I thought it's a bit like starting a rental where there's a 1 month lease. It's like a month to month. And so, you go through a lot of effort to find a location that you're happy with, find, landowners that you're compatible with, a location that works for your life. And then organising things like, is there a flat spot there? How are you going to manage water? Are your solar panels blocked by trees? Where can you park your car? Where are you going to go to school, library, work? Where you is there a shed that you can put your extra stuff in? There was so many factors in choosing a spot. And so it's not fast, like it's not a straightforward process to replace that.
No, it's high stakes.
It's really, really stressful. And I just thought somebody could blow up our lives and make an emergency in our life just by going, oh, I don't think you're allowed to have a caravan on your property with people in it. Or even a 12-month lease would have provided me with more peace of mind if we were in a more conventional housing situation.
Yeah.
Because I would have known that I don't have to think about that until August next year or whatever it is. Yeah. It was hard.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I'm just imagining other scenarios of people, have their kids in school,
Yeah.
And if you get kicked out, it's not just a housing problem. You gotta still keep that kid going to school every day.
Yeah.
It's more than just you have to move house. Like you have to stay within the district or that kind of thing. And back to living on Christine's property for us in Taradale, some people might think, oh, well, you really lucked out. She was the mayor. And that would be the wrong conclusion. We didn't actually, I was very grateful to Christine and team for,
hosting us. It was so generous.
So very generous. But if it came to a shit fight and somebody complains, she's the mayor.
She has to abide by the law.
We are out of there so fast, she wouldn't lickety split. We are gone.
Yeah.
If you think about a landlord who's a bit more robust at, wanting to have a tussle with council, that would have been a better option for us, because then you need that landlord to be willing to say, no, we think it's okay that they're doing what they're doing on our land, and you kind of make a case, and we know that the local law isn't really at our back beyond 6 weeks, but if you had a landlord who was willing, people
to go to the mat for you. They might buy you a little bit of extra time. You might get a few more months, but it's not. Yeah. It's still not the same as getting an actual legal green light to say you've got a tiny house. Great, put it there.
Bronwyn Machin, a councillor at the time in 2017, knew that the local laws were coming up for review, and she could see that tiny houses on wheels could provide a housing solution that would fit in with the strategic objectives of the council. So she asked Fred to make a submission to the council to consider tiny house law change in the local law review, and to make the conceptual link for the council that it would be in alignment with their strategic goals.
And so we did. We created it was just really a letter saying that you could satisfy your strategic goals by making a way to have tiny houses be a more permanent solution for our housing crisis. So in part of that early submission, we referenced the Yarra Ranges local council who had just very recently done the very same thing. They'd done a review of their local laws, and one of the things that they said was that housing is a human right, according to the UN, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, that housing is one of those rights. And as such, they said, we want to allow camping in a caravan without limitations. So what they did, very innovative thing, they got rid of their time-bound living in a caravan time. I think theirs was probably 28 days like everybody else. And they just said, get rid of that. You can live in your caravan as long as you don't make yourself a nuisance. What a fantastic low bar. And I proposed that in the very first submission that, hey, it is a human right and you could make it, just don't make yourself a nuisance. Well, when you put in a submission for any of the local laws, you get to speak to council about 5 minutes. So there was a large group of people at this public meeting. They asked about sewage and some things. It was basically a friendly exchange, gathering information. What impacted me most was the applause. I feel a bit choked up. People just applauded. They just burst out. Other people had gone forward and made their comments to council. None of it had gotten an applause. I was saying just a very simple thing, but you could hear the support that was literally at my back, you know? And I thought, well, this has got legs. I was like, wow, people really want this in my local home shire. So that was great.
When the council went to draft the new local laws in 2019, they didn't go for the Yarra Ranges type of law. Christine Henderson talks here about how the council's initial thought was to make a distinction between tiny houses and caravans in the local law, to allow people to live in tiny houses even if they can't live in traditional touring caravans on private property. Here's Christine.
So the push was on to try and get an exemption, I suppose, or get a special case for tiny houses and tiny houses on wheels. But the local law people, the head of those services, planning and services at the time, was adamant that no, it couldn't be done. And in that he was correct that anything on wheels has to be classified in the same way. So tiny house on wheels, caravan, whatever you've got, it's a temporary structure.
Right, so he was saying you can't make a separate law for a tiny house on wheels to a caravan.
That's right.
So that method didn't work.
That's right, because his idea was that anyone living in a caravan, that was just terrible and should never be allowed. Despite the fact that we do have quite a lot of people living in caravans and long term. But the guy at the time in charge of it all in council was implying that because you can't separate tiny houses and caravans, one rule has to apply for them all. You're going to have a proliferation of people living in caravans in terrible circumstances, surrounded by junk, keeping terrible lots of animals and being just a blight on society, basically, and a big problem for his department in compliance. And therefore, tiny houses on wheels, sorry, can't do it.
Right. So was he speaking from a planning perspective? There's nothing in the planning scheme about caravans.
No,
He's more compliance on local laws then, I suppose.
Yeah, he was in charge of local laws.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. And all caravans are inherently bad. It's just basically, and it is a slippery slope kind of a position.
No living in caravans for more than 6 weeks. Definitely bad.
So they drafted a local law on tiny houses.
The proposed law that was created by the staff at council, I kind of started to get wind of this when Bronwyn emailed me and said, you need to have a look at this. And it was pretty awful. It halved the amount of time that you could live in your tiny house in a caravan without a permit from 6 weeks to 3 weeks, 21 days. And it allowed a permitting process of up to 6 months, but it put in A through K ways of council or council staff saying no. It basically was really bad news for tiny houses. It was at that moment that we got to put our heads together and we made a fantastic document with all kinds of citations, citing housing studies and all the utility. Because when that bad proposal was made, we said, well, we're going to get on our horse and try and make sort of a community movement that lets them know that this is not what we want. And
by that time, COVID was already happening.
Yes.
Like we'd already experienced our first lockdowns in Victoria, and knowing that it was going to be really important for people to be able to isolate, and and there was already a problem of an aging population, and so we were thinking how useful a tiny house in someone's back garden would be for a grandma who wants to be close to their grandkids, and similar situations like that.
In this 11-page submission that we put together, as a rebuttal essentially to the drafted local law change, we cited lots of research, including stats around housing affordability and the need for medium and long-term housing options in our area to help people recover from housing crises,
or from being squeezed out of the rental market, and on the increasing need for single-person household dwellings in the area.
One of the other things that we cited was the Victorian Public Tenants Association saying at that time that there were 100,000 people on the waiting list for public housing in Victoria.
A few years prior to that, it was already a 26-year waiting list to access public housing, which is, what's represented there. And it's just worse now. It's just impenetrable.
Yeah. We cited the Australia Housing and Urban Research Institute article about how young people would not find it possible to enter the housing market.
Yeah.
But we knew from our own experience that people who were buying trailers from us and building their tiny houses, we had years of experience doing that, and people were actually saving their money whilst living in a tiny house on, parents' property, so zero rent, and they were accumulating money for their, dream home with a foundation and enough room to raise kids and, have land. So people were using it already as a stepping stone, but there was no provision. If you can't legally do that, well, then you can't save the money for a house.
Yeah, totally.
We made this submission hoping to convince the councillors to change their proposed law, of course, but we also wanted to share it with other members of the community so that they could use the information in their own submissions. So
we made a video, and there was a fire in my gut about it because, and in a way, that terrible proposed law was a good thing in the end because it just fired us up. How can you actually think of making it harder? So we put it out there on our media, and we asked that people copy and paste our proposal and add their own words, whatever they wanted. And, this is the deadline to get it in by. And the tiny house ecosystem started to respond. People who had been in workshops in the past, over those past 2 years, sent it to them, and then also just put it out on social media. And we asked them to copy us in on their submission, so we kind of had an idea how many the council was getting. Well, there were over 200 people who submitted in that period. And that really, at the time, it was quite significant at the council end to receive that many submissions for one part of their local law, the Section 13, camping on private property. And that was a high point, to put that out and feel the response. Again, people at your back. You're not just out there, beating a drum by yourself, not getting anywhere. There was a chorus of people who were similarly offended by and just appalled at how awful the law was that they were proposing. And we proposed a different one. Yeah, I think what we realized was if we leave it up to them, they're going to come up with something awful. We need to put down on paper what our dream is. And at the time, but we were also debating, well, how much can we actually ask for? Because if I had my druthers, I'd have Yarra Ranges. Don't make yourself a nuisance. Open slather, no permit.
Yeah.
But then we said, well, we need to give them something that's an alternative to what they've proposed. And so we kind of was trying to split the difference, and we were aiming for 2 years of permanence, a 2-year permit that would then be able to be renewed essentially indefinitely, but would be reviewed after 2 years. We thought that was a moderate proposal. And we addressed things like, meeting council standards for sewage, whatever it is that they wanted to say to us, or whoever wanted to do this. Well, we would do whatever you ask for the sewage side of things. So these 200 submissions get done, and then basically the door closes. And we wanted to know what was happening behind the closed doors, but we weren't really permitted. That was the end of the social commenting period, and it just went silent until they put forward what was then going to be voted on by the council.
Here's Christine on what was happening inside council at the time.
Bronwyn Machin and I pushed very hard and said we want to make it longer. We think that it's just in the current circumstances we find ourselves, and the number of people who are wanting to build tiny houses and live in them, and in yards, with their family or with friends who are saying, yes, you can put one in our backyard. We really want that to happen. And so we were told, oh, well, it can't be permanent, but, we can extend it out. And we were hopeful we were going to get something that looked like 2 years and repeatable. Like you might be able to extend it out.
Yeah, and that's what we were campaigning for. That's so 2 years repeatable.
Okay, everything right after 2 years. Income, the local laws officer. Yep, all right. So you dealt with it. I mean, the main worry is about your wastewater.
Okay,
you can't have sewerage, in the street. But if the compliance people came in and saw that there was no issue with the wastewater and that everything seemed hunky-dory, then we thought, okay, we should be able to get another 2 years.
Yeah, and that provides a level of stability for that person.
Exactly.
They might have an inspection on a every 2 year basis, but they could essentially know that they were allowed to live in their tiny house.
But that's not how it played out.
So I think we were waiting for the final draft to come. The process is councillors get a briefing. We see what's going to come to council in a week or two. The final stuff. Well, we've done the public consultation. We've talked to you. We've got all the things. Here it is. And Bron and I sat down and read it. And it was 6 months. And in special circumstances, those 6 months might be extended for another 6 months, up to an absolute maximum of 2 years.
Yeah, it was devastating.
We went, what? After all the campaigning, all the listening to you people, all the public, the massive number of people that have come and spoken to us, even in public question time, in previous meetings, just really campaigning, the letters, the emails, the stuff in the papers. And we just looked at each other, and the other councillors went, oh, well, it looks like that's all we can get. And we just said, we're shafted. We've been shafted.
Yeah.
That's it. He's done it. And so that was what was passed. Because, of course, it wasn't the only law. We had a whole suite of laws to pass.
Yeah, that wasn't the only thing on the agenda that week. You had to get through stuff.
Yeah. And, so we were really, very upset.
Yeah.
Just to recap the stages here. They had drafted a really hostile law, we had campaigned for an improved one, and council staff went away after public consultation where they amended the drafted law under advisement from the head of planning at the time. When they presented that newly drafted local law, it was better than the initial draft, but it was not nearly what anyone was hoping for. A permit to live in a tiny house on private property was available for 6 months, and only under special circumstances, which were unspecified. And that 6 months might be renewed up to 2 years maximum, which meant that by seeking a permit, a tiny house dweller would effectively start the timer on when they had to leave. So it was just not a desirable option to seek out the permit to begin with. I asked Fred what it was like for him to hear about that law after all of his efforts in leading that campaign.
It was hard to really let myself feel what it would mean for others. I mean, that's really kind of more painful than you could really... It's overwhelming to think about the obstacles now somebody was going to have to go through with no assurance that they would get through it. It looked like tiny houses in a more permanent fashion was sort of off the table for so many. For me personally, I had hoped that Mount Alexander Shire, where I lived, would be leading this, because I'd visited a lot of places and I could hear from talking to the councillors that there was interest. But then this planner at our local council, he wielded a lot of power behind the scenes. He was unelected, and I'm told that there was an 11-page document that was for council eyes only, and it basically was not supportive, and it was the rationale behind the very, very restrictive laws. But it wasn't part of a discussion. We weren't allowed to read it. We weren't allowed to see it. And so that one person sort of ruled the day.
There were some wins in the local law change. It went from the proposed 3 weeks of living in a tiny house on private property to 6 weeks without a permit. And they removed all those A through K reasons to reject a permit application. They offered a minimum of 6 months living under a permit rather than a maximum of 6 months. So all these things were improvements. However, they introduced a specific ruling against having a commercial relationship with someone camping on private property, a limit that has stuck and the ramifications of which are still being reckoned with today. But we'll hear more about that in later episodes. So we here at Fred's Tiny Houses, Fred and I, we thanked the 200 plus people who made their submissions, and essentially we put on a brave face for the video where we announced the local law changes. It was tough. We were disappointed. However, the internal cogs of council were turning and change was brewing behind the scenes. A few months after this local law review occurred, a new set of councillors were elected in November in 2020, with 4 fresh faces elected from a total of 7 councillors. So that's 4 people making a new majority of new people. And we didn't know it, but the head of planning left his role as well. So that following year in 2021, Kaz Nielsen from My Home Network called us at Fred's Tiny Houses to say that they were going to ask the new councillors to reconsider the tiny house laws. I didn't even know what My Home Network was, and Fred and I were pretty pessimistic about their chances given what we'd just been through. Like, do you remember when Kaz called me? Do you remember your reaction to that?
Well, I was like, okay, let's keep going. I'll come and talk to your group.
Yeah.
You know? And I thought, well, we'll see, what kind of energy there was.
Yeah, I just thought, good luck. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Really? You're going to do that again?
Yeah.
We've just tried. It was so bad. And I was incredulous. I thought, do you think they're going to put money into changing it? It costs money to change a local law. They've just reviewed it.
Yeah.
Do you think that you're going to get traction on this?
Yeah.
And she was going to try. And I was like, all right, good luck. We were burnt out. It was horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. We just didn't account for Kaz.
Kaz Nielsen, next episode. The My Home Network coordinator, who is the force of nature, who led the next campaign for tiny house law change here in Mount Alexander Shire, which was ultimately successful. This week, we've heard the story of the first attempt for changing the local laws, when there was a scheduled local law review and with 2 very supportive councillors and a loud and active tiny house community campaigning for change. But it wasn't enough to break through the lead planner's perception that living in tiny houses or caravans was a threat to the nature of the town and a huge compliance issue. While gains were made in this campaign and hard won, they were not a satisfactory outcome for people wanting to live in tiny houses on private property in our shire. But as the saying goes, it all works out in the end, so if it's not working out, it's not the end. Indeed, it was just the beginning. I've come to think of this round of campaigning as raising community expectations for what was possible, whetting the collective appetite, if you will, for more progressive tiny house laws. Okay, so let's list some takeaways from this experience. Local law reviews are required every 10 years, so it can be a good time to plan a campaign given that the councillors have to commit time and energy and money towards changing the local laws. Find out when your local council is due to review their local laws by looking at the dates on the front of the local law document and plan a campaign 18 months ahead. Identify any friendly councillors who might be amenable to the idea of changing local laws to support tiny house living, and have a meeting with them about what's possible. Gather interested parties, including tiny house businesses in your area and members of the Australian Tiny House Association, to mount a campaign in your area. So stick around for the next instalment of the story of how this little shire in central Victoria made a big leap towards providing access to affordable housing by changing their local laws in favour of tiny houses on wheels. Thanks to our guests, the long-time councillor and tiny house champion, Councillor Christine Henderson, who has been deeply involved in all the efforts to get tiny house laws changed here in our shire. And thanks to my beautiful husband, Fred Schultz, founder and co-director of Fred's Tiny Houses and leader in the Tiny House Australian movement since 2015. Thanks too to Rob Law for fixing my audio file when I interviewed Christine. I'm a rookie and a bit of a hack when it comes to this recording stuff, and he totally saved my file from being inaudible. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Jara people in Dja Dja Wurrung country. Music for this episode is by Scott Buckley. Candid Tiny House was written, recorded, edited and produced by me, Shannon Schultz from Fred's Tiny Houses. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends about it. Rate and review it. Generally share the love. And stick around for next episode of Candid Tiny House. Stay candid.